Hi, everyone. My name is Eric Esteves, and I'm the Executive Director of the Lenny Zaken Fund. And today, our session is on strategic planning, and we are joined by Stephen Pratt, who is the president of Impact Catalyst, and he's also joined by his colleagues, Lauren Dybel and Jessica Arbeza. Lauren is a consultant, and Jessica is an associate consultant. And really, this session is to really do a medium deep dive on strategic planning in all of its aspects and what it entails and things to look out for, think about, but also there's a space for you to ask questions of the three of them, and also just share any current hurdles that you may be facing or current challenges that you may be facing with respect to strategic planning. So with that, I won't do a long intro because you received bios of our three presenters via email. But with that, I will turn it over to Stephen.
Great. Thank you very much, Eric and Dominique. It's great to be back here again this year to do this, and lovely to see you all. And we'll go ahead and get into it as Eric suggested, and folks can join us in progress. And yes, I'm joined by my colleagues Lauren Dybel and Jessica Arbeza. And Lauren will be doing some of the presentation with me, and Jess is going to be managing questions in the chat. So if you have questions along the way, two ways to handle that before we get to the Q&A part. One is to jot it down on a piece of paper or whatever device you want to use to remember it. The other is you can throw the question into the chat and Jessica will track it so that we make sure we get to it at the end of the presentation today. So I'm going to do some slides up front for about 20-25 minutes here just to frame conceptually what we're talking about. Lauren is going to spend a little time talking about the nitty-gritty of how we translate these concepts into action, and then we're going to open the floor up for your questions, comments, etc. So with that said, I am going to share screen now. And whoa, sorry about that. We went way to the top. Let me just talk a bit about how we're structuring today. We're going to spend some time up front talking about really what is the case for doing strategy, what do we mean by it, how do you build it. We're going to spend a fair amount of time also talking about sustainability, financial sustainability and strategy, and how those things intersect. And then finally, we'll get into the Q&A and discussion. So for starters, let's talk about why strategy now. I think one of the questions that we often get asked with these things is, given all of the uncertainty in the world, I think this has been particularly true in the COVID era, but you can throw in all of the other reasons for uncertainty that we could add into that. The question is this a good time to do strategy? And I think our answer is, it's always a good time to do strategy. And the reason for it is, for us, as we think about what strategy means, we think of this notion of strategy as the signal that cuts through all the static, all the noise that's there. And that, there's always going to be noise. There's always going to be static, or to put it in real terms, there's always going to be uncertainty in the world. And frankly, the more uncertain the world is, the more important it is that you establish a set of strategic principles or ideas. So really thinking then about strategy as how you cut through the noise, what the signal is that gets you there. Another part of this is that sometimes I think people tend to think of strategy as a linear process, that it has a start, a middle, and end. That we have this plan. There's an old expression, people make plans and then God laughs. And I think part of what we want you to think about as you think about executing a strategy is this notion that many parts of the strategy are going to involve kind of two steps forward, one step back. There'll be a lot of testing, learning from the testing, and then recalibrating, coming back and coming up with a new approach to move you through the strategy. We'll talk more about that as we get into the implementation. Last but not least, we want to reinforce this notion that there is the notion of a strategy and there's a notion of a plan. We actually think the phrase strategic plan is meaningless because the strategy is about why you do and how you do your work. The plan is about what you do to carry that forward. And really understanding that distinction is pretty critical to wrapping your heads around strategy. So, what do we mean by that? Let's start getting concrete. I want to spend a little time just talking as a general framework about how you build out a strategy in easy steps. And by the way, I should have said this at the beginning. We will send out this presentation to all of you after the meeting today. So if you're like trying to scribble down notes as I'm talking really fast and starting to get some case of heartburn and that sort of thing, I want to reassure you, you can look through it more slowly afterwards. And if you have questions that sink in 3 days later on this, you can email them to us and we'll be happy to answer them. So don't worry, this isn't your only shot at getting your heads wrapped around this. So, looks like we've got some more folks trying to get in here, so I'm going to go ahead and admit them. All right. First, when we think about approaching a strategy, the place we start, remembering again that we talk about this why you do and how you do, we start with the why. And so every nonprofit organization exists to address either a social problem or a social opportunity, or sometimes a combination of those two things. But at its core, you're here to address that thing. And on the other side of that, you want to have an impact on that problem or opportunity. And so it's really interesting because in some ways people think, oh, well, that's our mission statement. We've got that down. And that may very well be true. It may be wrapped up in your mission statement. But often the nature of the opportunity that you're trying to address, the problem you want to solve, is evolving over time. And so the beginning of a strategy process is really thinking about what's the problem or opportunity we're trying to address right now? What are the conditions in the world that kind of shape our perspective of that problem or opportunity? And then what's the impact in a reasonable period of time, say 3 to 5 years, that we're hoping to have on that? Notice that we don't say solve the problem here, because it's rare that a problem of any significance is going to be solved in 3 years or 5 years. So thinking more about what progress do you want to make toward that problem or opportunity over the period that you're covering in the strategy. That's the first stage to this. And then from that, you need to really understand the environment in which you're doing this. So this is really thinking both internally and externally. We start internally. So we start by talking to all of the people within an organization, your staff, some board members, sometimes clients, that sort of thing, to get a sense of what are you good at? What are the things you're struggling with? What are the assets you're bringing to the table? And if there are challenges, liabilities, you have a huge budget, structural budget deficit that's standing in your way, you've had a hard time attracting volunteers or donors or board members, any of those challenges, we want to think realistically about those internal assets and liabilities as a starting point. And then you need to look externally. You need to look at the world in which you're trying to do this and have this impact and understand how has that changed. And perhaps it's changed for the better. I chair the board of a food security organization, and one of the environmental aspects of that that's changed is people are taking food insecurity far more seriously today than they were 5 years ago. We have many more people who've recognized this is a fundamental problem and that access to healthy food is a fundamental human right. Believe it or not, 5 years ago, we were still trying to convince people that this was a top priority. I don't think anybody on this call today needs convincing that food security is a top priority. So that's a positive change in the environment. Obviously, the negative change in the environment is there are far more food insecure people today than there were 5 years ago. So we have way more need, but we also have an environment where the need we're trying to address is being taken seriously and is being seen as a priority by donors, by policymakers, by partnering agencies, all of that. Then we want to think about where are the gaps? And these could be unmet needs that could be filled. And thinking about what is it that you as an organization are bringing to the table that's unique to this. So I think this is often the place where organizations are most challenged to articulate this because, frankly, I think we all think that we're unique and special and that sort of thing. But if you take a step back, you may realize, you know, there are a dozen organizations that are thinking about food security in Cambridge, which is where Food for Free, the group I chair, works. So, and Somerville. So the question there is, all right, what is it about what Food for Free is doing on food security that's different from the Margaret Fuller Neighborhood House's food pantry? What is different from what the Greater Boston Food Bank is doing, et cetera? What's the thing that we're doing here that could actually add value to this environment, to the challenges that we're seeing, to the opportunities that are in there? And then that takes us to thinking about different scenarios about how you could move forward. So the abbreviation here, TOC, is that maybe dreaded phrase, maybe phrase you're familiar with, theory of change. But really what we try to think about here is actually constructing some competing visions of what your theory of change could be. So thinking about the idea, it could be that the differences are in the nature of the challenge that you're trying to take on for the organization. So there could be scenarios where you're taking on a really broad version of the challenge. There could be scenarios where you're taking on a really narrow and specific challenge. Again, I'm going to use the food security example to be concrete here and say, you could broadly say, the challenge is there are more food insecure people in the communities we serve today than there were 10 years ago. We want to lower that number. That's the impact we could have on it. A more narrow version of it, and this is where we landed with Food for Free strategy, was to think about the idea that for many of the food insecure, we're in the category we often refer to as the working poor. And most of the access points for emergency food support are available in hours that are not really convenient for people who are working multiple shifts. So the food pantry may be open, but it's open on Thursday from 4 to 6 o'clock. And if you don't happen to be free and off work from 4 to 6 o'clock, you're not getting into the food pantry. You're not getting access to that food. So for us, the nature of our strategy was thinking about actually us as a supply chain innovator in the emergency food system. And our whole strategy is built around getting food to unusual places, less usual suspect places that are going to be easier for the food insecure to access, like after school markets, so that when parents are picking up their kids from school, they can access our markets that are in every Cambridge schoolyard and Somerville schoolyard at different points of each month. Having a weekend backpack program where kids are taking food home every weekend to supplement the emergency food that these families are accessing, things like that. So thinking about the theory of change is really thinking about, again, how big or small is the challenge you want to take on. It could be thinking about different interventions that you could lead that get you to the impact that you want to have. But really, the core of the strategy is thinking about what's the nature of the challenge we're taking on for the next 5 years, what's the impact we're going to have, and what are we uniquely bringing to the table to try to address that within our strategy. And then finally, you have to get realistic about your readiness to implement this. And there's really 3 core ideas behind this. Lauren's going to get into some of this and more specifics a little later in the conversation. But first of all, you need to think about people and think about both capacity and capability. So capacity means bandwidth. Are there enough hours in the day for your staff to do the things that you want to take on? Or are the kinds of things that you want to take on either going to require you to shift how people are spending their time or add new team members to do it? And then capability is really about, do you have the right skill sets to do these things? So, for example, if you want to get into doing supply chain innovation like food for free, do you have people on the team who actually understand how to do that, how supply chains work? Or are you going to have to bring somebody in who has that kind of specialized skill and knowledge who could help you do that? Obviously, understanding your budget, how much is this going to cost to do this? And how are you going to sustain this? What are the revenue sources, both that you might rely on to get the strategy off the ground, but also what is your thinking about what the long-term approach to revenue is going to be and how that's going to work for you? All right. I've moved very quickly through all this. I'm sure you have lots of questions. I'm seeing lots of stuff being thrown into the chat, which I appreciate. We will get to that shortly. Um, so let's then talk about what are the main components to that strategic plan that's the end point of this whole thing. So typically, we would have these components in it. So there would be the case, which is really, why are you doing what you're doing? Why is this important? The opportunity, why now? Why your organization? And then the plan would obviously be at some level of detail. What are you actually going to do here to get this done? The financials, so there would be something in there about, what kind of budget, what kind of investments you're going to need to do this. And there would be what we would call risk analysis, which would really be thinking as realistically as we can about what are some of the obstacles that might stand in your way in carrying out the strategy, and what are the things that you might do to mitigate those risks. How might you respond if this part of the strategy goes off kilter or that part goes off kilter? I should also note all of these components would go into an internal version of this strategy that might be for your eyes, your staff's eyes, your board's eyes, that sort of thing. I don't know that the risk analysis is something that I would necessarily be sharing with external donors. Although there's some donors who you might want to show that risk analysis to show them, hey, we're thinking realistically about this stuff. We actually have considered this and have a game plan for this. We can talk more about what are the situations where that's safe or unsafe for you if you'd like. All right, so we've touched a little on sustainability. I want to spend another minute on it. And before I do that, my dog wants to bark and I want to take a sip of coffee. All right. Is everybody else doing okay? All right, good. So we're going to talk a bit about sustaining a strategy and some of the key things to think about for this. So first of all, let's talk about what may be obvious but is worth calling out, which is for any nonprofit organization, you're trying to pursue success on two different planes simultaneously. So on one hand, you have the program model. So going back to that whole theory of change conversation, you have a challenge or opportunity you want to address. You have an impact you want to have on it. You have some things you're doing as an organization that are getting you from here to there. That's what we would call your program model. So you need to deliver on that. That needs to work, right? At the same time, you need to succeed on a financial plane as well. You need to find the money to pay for this, and you need to do that not just in 1 year, but repeatedly over time. And if you fail on the program model, it's kind of game over, and what's the point? But obviously, if you fail on the financial model, eventually it's also game over. And so ideally, what you want is to figure out a way to be able to execute on both of these at the same time. And that's what makes our jobs leading nonprofit organizations so friggin' fun. Let's face it. All right. So the key idea that we want to talk about here is what we would call the customer and the client, and getting the distinction between those two concepts clear in your minds. Because if I asked you who your customer is, you may very well immediately go to the people you serve, and you wouldn't be wrong. But we think of the people you serve, the people who benefit from your programs, as your clients. And then we think about the people who pay for you to deliver those services as your customer. And getting clear on who your customer is and who your client is really critical to doing this work. It's what we call decoupled strategy. So in the for-profit world, it's actually much simpler to do this sort of thing, because in the for-profit world, chances are the person who's paying for the good or service you're selling is also the person who's receiving that good or service. In the nonprofit world, it's often one entity that's paying for the service and another entity who's receiving the service. And the thing about nonprofit strategy is you have to deliver value for both. You can't just deliver value for one or for the other. And here's the trick to nonprofit strategy. The better aligned the value you're delivering to your customer is to the value you're delivering to your client is, the more sustainable the strategy is. The more you have a gap between what you're promising your customer and what you're promising your client, the harder it's going to be to sustain the strategy. Again, I'll give you a quick concrete example from my past, which is in the early 2000s, I helped found an organization here in Boston called Boston After School and Beyond, which is still around. And when we founded it, it was made up of 14 foundations in the city of Boston, Harvard University, and the mayor's office. And our job was to try to align on a strategy for after school and youth development in the city of Boston. And among the things we did was a survey of parents in Boston that we actually did several times over the course of the time I was there, that basically asked parents what was on their mind, what were their key needs, how did they feel about after school, did they believe in it, did they trust it, that sort of thing, did they want it or not want it, and if they did, what was working, what wasn't working, and if they were using after school, what was it that they wanted in the way of support and that sort of thing. Overwhelmingly, the answer we got from parents who were interested in after school programs was, we want a safe, emotionally nurturing place for our young people. We want to know that after school, when they go to, whether it's the Boys and Girls Club, a church basement, a citizen schools, an arts program, what have you, we want to know that our child is safe and that she is getting nurtured. The funders, on the other hand, had a different idea of what we needed from after school, which is that they wanted to narrow the academic performance gap, so-called performance gap, between urban students and suburban students in Massachusetts. And they saw after school as the lever that was going to do that. So now you can see what our strategic challenge was, which is that our customer, the funders, thought that Boston After School and Beyond was here to deliver academic impact and advancement. Our clients, on the other hand, saw this as something that was dealing with, we didn't have the phrase at the time, but we would now call it social emotional learning. Now, these things are not completely separate on two different planets. There are ways that you could construct a solid after school program that is delivering strong social emotional supports and also helping students advance emotionally. And indeed, there's evidence that the more of a foundation you have on social emotional health, the better a student is going to perform in school. We didn't get into any of those arguments. We just had arguments about which was more important, one or the other. And that made it really hard to sustain the work. So ideally, what you want to do is find what we would call the sweet spot between what your client wants and what your customer wants. So obviously, if you are being driven too heavily by the interests of your funders, your customer, you have what we often call mission creep, meaning that the funder is essentially pushing your mission and the focus of your mission rather than your community. On the other hand, if you have something that is just delivering value to your clients, but you don't have a paying customer for it, you have what we call an unfunded mandate. So again, ideally what you want is something where you're balancing the interests of your customer and your client. You're finding some way to thread that needle between them. That's the key to sustainability. And that, frankly, is why nonprofit strategy is way harder to develop and execute than for profit strategy, right there. Because as you can see, you have a much more complicated set of factors to navigate here. All right. So now I'm going to pause, take another drink of coffee. And Lauren, are you ready to talk about implementing?
I am ready. Thank you, Steve.
Awesome. Thank you.
So one of the ways that our team as consultants who do strategic planning work measures success with our clients is about how your strategy gets implemented. We care that it doesn't just remain a binder on a shelf, as Steve likes to say, and that this is actually a tool that you get to use. It's something that gets implemented as soon as it's been approved. And it's something that you're not just looking at when the time is right, but you have to look at and think about every day when you're making decisions for your organization. So one way that we help set folks up to do that is to develop an implementation plan or an action plan on the tail end of your strategy. So as Steve mentioned before, you can go through a strategy process, a strategic planning process, and you end up with a bunch of deliverables like a case statement, a set of strategic priorities, hopefully a plan around how you're going to implement those priorities. And the components of that plan fall into a couple of categories for us. We typically set this up in some sort of project management tool like Asana or Smartsheet, or use Google Sheets or Excel if it's more helpful for our clients. We start with categorizing the activities, the action steps you will need to take to implement your strategy. So this can look like some internal changes, right? It could be a revisit of the structure model. It could be cultural shifts, or it could be your strategic priorities, right? You're leaning more on one arm of your program model than another. And so those are the categories of action that kind of fall in the first step here. And then we ask our clients to help break that down into a series of action steps that you will need to take to move from where you currently are to where you want to be around those strategies. Then we help folks think about the timeline for implementing those things. We know that trying to do all of a strategy's implementation at once is totally unreasonable for most nonprofits. It takes, as Steve mentioned, a fair amount of capacity and capability. It requires a lot of attention. And so we help folks to think about at what point over the next, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, up to however long the strategy period is, will you spend working on each action item related to the strategies you want to implement. And then we want you to think about the responsibilities associated with that. Who in your organization is driving each action step? Who's overseeing category as a whole to ensure that it gets implemented? And who really has capacity or capability to do those things? As Steve mentioned earlier, there's a lot of times when capacity and capability are not internal to your organization already. So think about if you need to generate some additional capacity or capability, how might you do so? Who do those people need to be? What skills do they need to have? And then to think about success indicators. This is a great place to think about those process indicators, those outputs that will demonstrate that you have implemented your strategy and that your strategy is moving forward. So if your action item is something like working on a community engagement assessment of your program model, your success indicators might be that a survey goes out, or that your stakeholders engage in focus groups with you over a 6-month period. So it's important to think about how you'll know that that action item, that action step has been achieved, so that you can check it off when it's done and know how to keep moving to a set of action items that may be staggered or built off of each other. I'm going to give you an example based off of one of the clients we've worked with in the last couple of years. So first of all, they had a multifaceted strategy. They were a youth development organization, and their strategy ended up with them wanting to think about how to explore opportunities to spread their program model. This was just one strategy that falls within their greater strategic plan. They were also expanding one of their existing program arms and kind of tapering down on a second one. So what they thought was, it might be helpful for us to use this strategy period to think about how to explore opportunities for spread of our program model. And we do often find that some clients use a strategy period to do a deeper investigation into a strategy they may want to take on in the next iteration of their strategy or strategic plan. So if, for example, the strategy is to explore opportunities to spread a program model, you may find action items under that, like holding exploratory conversations with your stakeholders, with your community members, or with your staff and board. Setting up some go, no-go points that will tell you, once I have answers to the questions I need, how will I know if I can move forward with a spread in one community or through an online platform or something like that. And then also to start building partnerships that would help you implement a spread to your program model down the line. So you'll see that those kind of rely on each other. You'll have your exploratory conversations first, or maybe you'll set your go, no-go points first, then hold your conversations and evaluate those against these critical decision points. And meanwhile, you're building partnerships in the event that you are able to move forward with a spread model. A timeline for this could be a 6-month period. It could be that each action item starts at a different point in that 6-month period. But the intention is that you as a staff and as a board know when you are starting those action items and when you can expect them to be completed, so that we love to talk about action forcing events as a team. The idea that if you know there's a deadline, you can't drag this out forever. And it gives you a chance to hold yourself accountable to making sure that something gets done. Then to outline some sample responsibilities, maybe you have a lead person and support people that are working on each action item. Maybe the lead oversees, a couple of action items and they have different support people underneath. But this basically, the intention here is to think about who is going to be important to making sure that this action item is carried out and who will report back on whether or not this action item gets carried out. And then finally, some sample success indicators. As I mentioned, the point of this is for you to know that you've made progress towards your action item, towards your overall strategy implementation. And we like to think of these as your process indicators or your output indicators rather than an outcome indicator. So the example there might be outreach meetings to these partners or to your stakeholders in these exploratory conversations, or even how many MOUs are developed in pursuing partnerships or in exploring a spread into a new school or a new community or something like that. This, as I said, these are meant to be process indicators rather than something that tells you about the quality of the output, but they also set you up to build a space to think about what comes next, right? If I reach my target around the number of outreach meetings, what does that mean for how I can move forward with this strategy? Or if I don't reach my target for the number of MOUs developed, what does that mean for how I need to change the next set of action steps related to the strategy? Okay. I think I'm gonna pass it back to Steve now to kind of bring it together for us.
Great. So we've just thrown a whole bunch of stuff at you really fast. And I guess the first thing I'll ask before I open it up to general questions and comments is there a slide that we moved through quickly that you'd like me to jump back to and explain something a little bit more, something that you missed the first time that it would be helpful for us to go over again? All right. Hearing none, then I would love to just, I'm going to stop sharing screen so we can all look at one another. And yes, Mercy, the slides are going to be sent out to everybody as a follow on to today's conversation. And if you have follow up questions after you get a chance to look at those slides, you're quite happy. We're quite happy to take those questions from you offline. So for today, I'd love to hear just in general questions that you have about strategy. Feel free to bring in your own kind of like, here's my situation, what should I do with it, that sort of thing. I should say two kind of ground rules for that as we go into it. Ground rule number one is we need to respect the confidentiality of spaces like this. We're all peers to one another here. So we're not taking this information anywhere outside of this room, and I expect you all to respect the same kind of commitment to your peers here. The second is if you can use the raise hand feature down there using the little reactions button, that'd be great. And yes, by all means, feel free to throw questions into the chat here. And I see one from Miriam that I'm going to go ahead and put up. And yes, Eric, that is probably a good idea, just answering Eric's question about recording, given